Rain fell in a thin silver veil over the sprawling estate of Hawthorne Vale, turning the gravel paths into ribbons of dark glass and filling the evening air with the scent of damp roses and distant thunder. Inside the grand manor, however, there was nothing quiet about the night. Servants rushed through candlelit corridors carrying trays of crystal and silver, seamstresses hurried up staircases with trailing lace gowns, and the aristocratic guests who had begun arriving 2 days early for the Whitmore wedding filled the drawing rooms with laughter sharp enough to cut through velvet curtains. Every chandelier blazed as though determined to outshine the coming celebration, yet beneath the glittering light ran a quieter current of judgment and gossip. Among the many figures gliding through the corridors, one moved more carefully than the rest, as though she feared the house itself might reject her presence if she stepped too boldly. Miss Eleanor Whitmore carried a small stack of parchment invitations against her chest, her plain gloves trembling slightly as she passed clusters of elegantly dressed women who examined her the way one might inspect a poorly arranged bouquet. Eleanor possessed a quiet grace that no fashionable gown could create or destroy, but the modest blue dress she wore had already been judged unworthy of the occasion. She knew the whispers followed her wherever she went, like shadows trailing a candle flame. "Poor Eleanor," one lady murmured behind a silk fan as she passed. "Invited to her cousin's wedding only to fetch and carry like a servant." Another replied with a laugh too delicate to be kind. "Well, my dear, a girl without fortune must make herself useful somehow." Eleanor heard every word, though she kept her gaze lowered with practiced composure. Years of living among relations who measured worth by dowries had taught her that dignity often required silence. Still, there was a faint tightening in her chest as she climbed the curved staircase toward the quieter wing of the estate, where fewer guests wandered and the candles burned lower. The invitations she carried were not for the celebrated guests filling the ballroom below, but for those the household preferred to acknowledge quietly, almost reluctantly. At the top of the staircase, she paused beside a tall window where rain tapped softly against the glass. Beyond the misted garden stood a row of ancient oak trees, their branches swaying like silent witnesses to the estate's endless pageantry. Eleanor took a slow breath before consulting the final envelope in her hand. The elegant script spelled a name that even the boldest gossip in London spoke with careful curiosity. His Grace, Duke Alexander Ashford. For a moment she hesitated. The servants had exchanged glances when she received this task, as though they had been handed a particularly cruel joke and she was the unsuspecting recipient. The Duke had not attended a public gathering in years. Stories drifted through society about the accident that had shattered both his carriage and his future, leaving the once celebrated nobleman confined to a wheelchair and hidden away from the world that had once admired him. Yet the invitation remained in her hands, and duty was a stubborn companion. Eleanor followed the corridor until the noise of the festivities faded into a distant murmur. At its end stood a heavy oak door slightly ajar, from which the soft glow of firelight spilled across the floorboards. She raised her hand and knocked gently. "Enter," came a voice from within, calm and unexpectedly warm. She stepped inside. The room felt different from the rest of the house, as though it belonged to another season entirely. Books lined the walls in tall orderly ranks, and a fire burned steadily in the hearth, filling the air with a comforting scent of wood smoke. Near the tall window sat a man in a dark wheelchair, a book resting loosely in his hand as he watched the rain beyond the glass. Duke Alexander Ashford did not resemble the broken figure Eleanor had imagined. Though pale from years spent indoors, his features carried a quiet strength, and his dark eyes lifted toward her with an alertness that suggested a mind far from defeated. For a moment neither of them spoke. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Eleanor said at last, stepping forward. "I have come with an invitation." He closed his book slowly and regarded her with thoughtful curiosity. "That is unusual," he said. "Most invitations reach me by way of a servant who prefers not to linger." Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I assure you, sir, I was asked only to deliver it personally." A faint smile touched his mouth, though there was something weary behind it. "And you obeyed," he said quietly. "That alone makes you braver than most of the guests celebrating downstairs." She extended the envelope. As he accepted it, their hands brushed for the briefest moment, and Eleanor was struck by the unexpected steadiness of his grip. "The household would be honored by your presence at the wedding tomorrow evening," she said. He studied the invitation without opening it, then looked back at her. "Tell me honestly, Miss Whitmore," he said gently, reading her name from the card she still carried, "do they truly expect me to attend, or was this sent merely to satisfy etiquette?" The question hung in the warm air between them, disarmingly direct. Eleanor hesitated, feeling the weight of every whisper she had heard that day. "I cannot speak for their expectations," she said carefully. "But if you wish to come, I would be glad of the company." The Duke's brows lifted slightly in surprise. "You would?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, gathering a small courage she had not known she possessed. "In truth, Your Grace, I was hoping you might accompany me." For a heartbeat the room seemed to hold its breath. Rain continued its quiet rhythm against the window, and the firelight flickered across the polished wheels of his chair. Then the Duke leaned back slowly, studying her with an expression that was no longer merely curious but deeply intrigued. "My dear Miss Whitmore," he said at last, his voice softened with something almost like amusement, "do you fully understand the scandal you have just invited?" Morning arrived at Hawthorne Vale beneath a pale sky washed clean by the night's rain, yet the calm light did little to quiet the restless gossip already spreading through the manor. Servants whispered in corridors, ladies paused mid-conversation to exchange knowing glances, and the polished floors carried rumors as efficiently as footsteps. By breakfast, nearly every guest had heard the astonishing tale that Miss Eleanor Whitmore had personally invited the reclusive Duke Alexander Ashford to attend the wedding. No one seemed certain whether the story was ridiculous or scandalous, but both possibilities made it irresistible. Eleanor herself became aware of the rumor long before she reached the breakfast room. A footman abruptly stopped speaking when she approached, while two elegantly dressed cousins watched her with identical smiles that concealed poorly disguised delight. She moved through the manor with the steady composure she had practiced for years, though beneath that calm surface her thoughts churned with restless uncertainty. The Duke's final question from the night before lingered in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. "Do you fully understand the scandal you have just invited?" At the time she had answered with little more than quiet honesty. She had said she believed kindness required no permission from society. The Duke had studied her face for several long seconds before dismissing her with a polite nod, promising only that he would consider the invitation. It was not a refusal, yet neither was it a promise. Now the entire house behaved as though she had orchestrated some bold social spectacle. "Eleanor, my dear," her cousin Lady Margaret called sweetly as she entered the breakfast room, "we hear you spent quite an intimate evening in the company of His Grace." A ripple of laughter followed the remark. Eleanor paused beside the long dining table, feeling dozens of curious eyes settle upon her like invisible weights. "I delivered an invitation," she replied simply. "And invited him to escort you, did you not?" Margaret continued, leaning forward with bright interest. "Such an adventurous choice." Another lady sighed dramatically. "Imagine arriving at a wedding accompanied by a crippled duke. One would hardly know whether to applaud the courage or pity the desperation." The words stung more sharply than Eleanor expected. She lowered her gaze to the teacup before her, forcing her hands to remain steady. "His Grace deserves respect," she said quietly. Margaret lifted a brow. Respect is rarely the same as spectacle. The conversation dissolved into murmurs, but Eleanor sensed their amusement lingering long after she left the room. By the time she stepped into the gardens later that morning, the gossip had grown bold enough to follow her openly through the estate. Yet the cool air offered a small relief from the suffocating laughter indoors, and she wandered toward the rose paths where servants were arranging white blossoms for the wedding ceremony. She had just reached the gravel walk when the distant sound of carriage wheels broke the quiet. At first she assumed another noble guest had arrived, but the approaching carriage bore a crest she recognized instantly, the Silver Hawk of Ashford. The horses slowed before the manor steps, and a liveried driver climbed down to open the door. Eleanor watched from the garden path, curiosity tightening in her chest. A footman hurried across the lawn toward her carrying a small velvet box and a folded card. "For you, Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing slightly. She accepted the items with bewildered care. The velvet box felt unexpectedly heavy in her palm, its deep burgundy surface embroidered with the Ashford crest. Inside rested a brooch of remarkable elegance, fashioned from silver leaves surrounding a single pale sapphire that caught the morning light like a drop of captured sky. Eleanor stared at it in stunned silence. "What is it?" Margaret's voice appeared suddenly behind her, sharp with curiosity. Eleanor unfolded the card before answering. The handwriting was strong and deliberate. "If society insists upon watching us, Miss Whitmore, we must give them something worthy of their attention. Alexander Ashford." Margaret's eyes widened as she glimpsed the brooch. "Good heavens," she whispered. "The Duke sends you gifts now?" A servant nearby pretended not to listen, though Eleanor could feel the moment spreading through the garden like sparks across dry grass. By afternoon the entire household would know. Yet beneath the rising embarrassment was something else, something warmer, steadier. The Duke had not mocked her invitation. Instead he had accepted the scandal with an elegance that transformed ridicule into quiet defiance. Later that day Eleanor found herself returning to the quiet wing of the estate almost without thinking. The corridor felt strangely familiar now, its dim candles and polished wood echoing with a calm absent from the crowded ballroom below. When she knocked upon the Duke's door, the same gentle voice answered, "Enter." He sat by the window as before, though the sunlight now touched the dark wood of his wheelchair and illuminated the thoughtful curve of his expression. When he saw the brooch pinned carefully at Eleanor's collar, a faint smile appeared. "I see my message arrived safely," he said. "You should not have sent such a gift," Eleanor replied, though her tone held more wonder than reproach. "On the contrary," he said softly, "you invited me into society again. The least I could do was ensure society noticed." She studied him in silence, realizing that the rumors swirling outside this room seemed almost powerless here. For the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Vale, Eleanor felt the strange comfort of being truly seen. Yet even as the moment warmed between them, distant laughter echoed from the hallway, carrying the unmistakable sound of guests repeating the newest rumor. The Duke listened quietly before meeting her gaze again. "Tell me honestly, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low but steady, "when the wedding music begins tomorrow evening, will you regret inviting a man the world has already discarded?" Dawn arrived at Hawthorne Vale wrapped in pale gold light that spilled through the tall windows and drifted gently across the quiet corridors. The manor had not yet awakened into the grand spectacle awaiting it, but the air already carried the soft tension of anticipation, like the hush before an orchestra's first note. Servants moved with careful urgency, arranging flowers along banisters and polishing silver trays until they gleamed like mirrors. Outside, carriages arrived one after another along the gravel drive, each bringing guests dressed in colors bright enough to rival the blooming gardens. In a small chamber at the far end of the second floor, Miss Eleanor Whitmore stood before a narrow mirror, her fingers loosely clasped as she studied her reflection. The room itself had none of the extravagant decoration reserved for honored guests, yet the early sunlight softened its plainness and filled it with quiet warmth. She wore the same modest gown she had worn the day before, though she had carefully brushed the fabric and pinned her hair with deliberate care. Her thoughts, however, were far from calm. The Duke's question from the previous evening lingered in her mind with remarkable persistence. "When the wedding music begins tomorrow evening, will you regret inviting a man the world has already discarded?" At the time she had answered with quiet conviction, assuring him she would not regret kindness. Yet morning had a way of sharpening reality. Beyond the door waited dozens of aristocrats who had already transformed her invitation into an object of amusement. If the Duke appeared beside her tonight, their whispers would grow louder still. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Whitmore," said a servant through the door, "a delivery has arrived for you." Eleanor opened it with mild confusion. The servant entered carrying a long ivory box tied with a ribbon the color of moonlight. "For me?" she asked. "Yes, miss. It arrived from His Grace this morning." Her breath caught slightly as she accepted the box. The servant withdrew, leaving her alone with the unexpected gift. For a moment Eleanor simply stared at it resting upon the small table beside the window, as though the object itself possessed a quiet gravity. When she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid, a soft gasp escaped her lips. Inside lay a gown. It was unlike anything she had ever owned. The silk shimmered with a delicate ivory sheen, its long skirts flowing like liquid light, while fine embroidery traced gentle patterns of leaves along the sleeves and bodice. The craftsmanship alone suggested remarkable expense, yet the design carried an understated elegance that seemed almost intentionally suited to her rather than to the grand spectacle below. Folded beside the gown was a small note. Eleanor unfolded it slowly. "Every lady deserves to enter a ballroom as though the world were waiting for her. Alexander Ashford." For several seconds she could only stare at the words, her heart beating with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. The gesture was thoughtful, undeniably generous, yet it also carried a quiet boldness that would only fuel the rumors already swirling through the manor. Still, as she lifted the gown from the box and felt the cool silk slip through her fingers, something inside her shifted. It was not pride exactly, nor excitement. It was the fragile sensation of being valued in a place where she had long been overlooked. Later that morning she stepped outside into the gardens, the new gown carefully hidden beneath a shawl. The air was bright and fragrant with roses, though the distant hum of arriving guests reminded her how quickly the day was unfolding. At the far end of the garden path she spotted the familiar figure of Duke Alexander Ashford waiting beside the marble fountain, his wheelchair positioned beneath the shade of a flowering tree. He looked up as she approached. "I wondered if you might come," he said quietly. Eleanor stopped beside him, the sunlight catching the sapphire brooch at her collar. "You should not have sent the gown," she said gently. "It is far too generous." A faint smile touched his expression. "Generosity is a luxury I possess in abundance," he replied. "Society rarely invites me to spend it." She hesitated before sitting on the stone bench near him. "Your gift will only encourage the gossip," she admitted. "Gossip requires little encouragement," he said calmly. "It thrives wherever boredom meets curiosity." For a moment they listened to the fountain's steady murmur. Then the Duke spoke again, his tone quieter. "Miss Whitmore, may I tell you something honestly?" "Of course." He gazed toward the distant manor, where guests now moved across the terraces in bright clusters. 3 years ago I was engaged to a lady who adored the life my title promised," he said. "When my carriage overturned on a winter road and left me unable to walk, she visited once. Only once." Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. "She told me she admired my courage," he continued softly. "Then she returned my ring the following morning." The confession carried no bitterness, only a weary clarity that made it all the more painful. "One learns quickly," he said, "that society loves a title, but rarely the man who carries it." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I believe society often confuses admiration with kindness," she said. "They are not the same." For the first time since she had known him, the Duke seemed momentarily speechless. "You speak as though you understand such disappointments yourself," he said. She smiled faintly. "A woman without fortune becomes familiar with quiet disappointments." The Duke studied her with renewed intensity, as though seeing her more clearly than before. Whatever he might have said next was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a young servant running breathlessly down the garden path. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore," he said between hurried breaths. "I beg your pardon, but there is trouble in the ballroom." Eleanor rose immediately. "What has happened?" The boy hesitated before answering. "The guests have begun laughing about you both, miss. They say the Duke will never appear tonight, and that your invitation was nothing more than a desperate attempt to draw attention." The words hung heavily in the bright morning air. For a long moment neither Eleanor nor the Duke spoke. Then Alexander Ashford slowly turned his wheelchair toward the manor, his expression calm but unmistakably resolved. "My dear Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "it appears society has already decided our story." He paused, his dark eyes steady with a spark of dangerous determination. "Which means tonight," he added softly, "we must decide how it ends." Evening descended upon Hawthorne Vale with the solemn elegance of a curtain falling before a grand performance. Hundreds of candles blazed within the towering windows, casting golden light across the gardens where the last of the guests arrived beneath velvet skies. The manor seemed transformed into a palace of music and shimmering silk, every corridor alive with laughter, perfume, and the low murmur of aristocratic conversation. Inside the great ballroom, chandeliers glittered like constellations suspended from the high painted ceiling. White roses cascaded along the banisters, their fragrance mingling with the faint sweetness of polished wood and candle smoke. Ladies in elaborate gowns drifted across the marble floor like living paintings, their jeweled fans fluttering with excitement as musicians tuned their violins upon a raised platform. Yet beneath the polished spectacle, anticipation carried a sharper edge tonight. Whispers had already spread through the hall. Miss Eleanor Whitmore would arrive with the forgotten Duke. Or perhaps she would arrive alone. Near the entrance stood Lady Margaret and a cluster of elegantly dressed guests, their voices lowered but their expressions bright with curiosity. "I give it another 10 minutes, Margaret said with amused confidence. "Then the poor girl will realize her mistake and slip quietly inside before anyone notices." A gentleman beside her chuckled. "And the Duke?" Margaret lifted a jeweled shoulder. "If he possessed the courage to appear in public again, he would have done so years ago." Laughter rippled softly through the group. At that very moment, in a quiet corridor beyond the ballroom doors, Eleanor Whitmore stood before a tall mirror, drawing one final breath. The ivory silk gown sent by the Duke fell gracefully around her, its soft folds catching the candlelight with every movement. The sapphire brooch rested at her collar, glimmering like a quiet promise. She had never felt so visible. Through the closed doors she could hear the orchestra beginning a lively waltz, the music rising and falling like waves against the shore. Each note seemed to echo the restless beating of her heart. Perhaps the Duke would not come. The thought had returned again and again throughout the evening preparations, whispered by servants, suggested by cousins, and reinforced by every curious glance cast in her direction. Yet even as doubt crept close, she remembered the steady resolve in Alexander Ashford's eyes that morning beneath the flowering tree. Which means tonight we must decide how it ends. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly and stepped forward. When the ballroom doors opened, the sound of music swelled into the corridor like a burst of light. Conversation slowed as she entered the hall, and for several long seconds the entire room seemed to study her. Not because she was the bride's cousin, but because she had come alone. A faint murmur rippled through the guests. There she is. And where is her noble escort? Perhaps he lost his nerve. Lady Margaret watched Eleanor cross the marble floor with thinly veiled satisfaction. My poor cousin, she said lightly to those around her. One almost feels sorry for her. Eleanor heard the whispers, though she refused to allow them to slow her steps. Each movement required quiet determination, yet she carried herself with a composure that surprised even her. She had chosen kindness, and whatever humiliation followed would belong not to her but to those who delighted in cruelty. Still, when she reached the edge of the ballroom and found no sign of the Duke, a small ache stirred behind her calm expression. The orchestra finished the first waltz. Applause followed. Then the great doors at the far end of the hall opened once more. At first the guests assumed another late arrival had entered, and only a few curious glances turned toward the doorway. But the murmuring grew suddenly uncertain, spreading across the room like wind rippling through tall grass. A figure appeared in the doorway. A man seated in a dark polished wheelchair. Behind him stood a liveried servant, though the servant did not push the chair forward. Instead, Duke Alexander Ashford rested his hands lightly upon the wheels and guided himself into the ballroom with deliberate calm. The music faltered. One violinist lowered his bow entirely. The guests who had moments earlier mocked his absence now stared in astonished silence as he crossed the threshold. The candlelight caught the sharp lines of his formal evening coat, the silver buttons gleaming against dark velvet. His posture was upright, dignified, and entirely unashamed. Every movement declared that he had not come to be pitied. He had come to be seen. The servant quietly withdrew, leaving the Duke to guide his wheelchair alone across the polished floor. The vast ballroom parted before him as though moved by an invisible tide. Conversation ceased. Fans stilled. Even Lady Margaret's confident smile faltered. Eleanor stood motionless near the center of the hall as Alexander approached. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and admiration. The distance between them seemed to stretch endlessly, yet the Duke moved with calm precision, his gaze never leaving her. When he finally reached her side, the silence surrounding them felt almost sacred. Miss Whitmore, he said gently, inclining his head. Your Grace, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment neither spoke further. Then the Duke turned his wheelchair slightly so that he faced not only Eleanor but the entire ballroom. The crowd leaned closer, drawn by curiosity stronger than decorum. His voice carried easily across the marble floor. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, I have been informed that my attendance this evening has become a matter of some speculation. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the guests. Alexander's expression remained composed. 3 years ago, he continued, an accident confined me to this chair and removed me from the elegant society gathered here tonight. In the time since, I have observed a remarkable truth. He paused briefly. Many people admire a title. Far fewer care to stand beside the man who carries it. The words settled over the room with quiet weight. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as she watched him speak with such unwavering clarity. Alexander then turned back toward her. Miss Whitmore, he said, his tone softening, entered my room yesterday not with curiosity nor with pity but with simple kindness. She invited me to accompany her tonight knowing full well what the world might say. Several guests lowered their eyes. And therefore, he continued steadily, it is not she who should feel embarrassment this evening. The Duke reached out his hand. It is my honor, he said, to accompany her. A hush swept across the ballroom. Eleanor placed her hand in his. The orchestra, uncertain but eager, slowly resumed the waltz. Couples began to move again across the marble floor, though many eyes remained fixed upon the quiet pair beside the dance. Alexander guided his wheelchair closer so they could speak without the entire hall listening. I am afraid, he murmured with faint amusement, that I may not offer you a proper dance. Eleanor smiled softly. You have already given me something far rarer than a dance, Your Grace. And what might that be? She glanced toward the watching crowd. Courage. For the first time that evening, the Duke's composed expression warmed into genuine laughter. Yet as the music swelled and the dancers circled around them, Alexander's gaze returned to Eleanor with new seriousness. "There is something more I must say tonight," he said quietly. Her heart quickened. "But if I speak it aloud," he added, "the consequences may be irreversible." The music rose toward its final crescendo. Across the ballroom, curious eyes lingered. And Eleanor realized that whatever Alexander Ashford intended to reveal next would not merely silence the whispers of society. It might change both of their lives forever. The music continued its graceful sweep across the ballroom, violins rising and falling like a tide beneath the glittering chandeliers, yet the air surrounding Eleanor Whitmore and Duke Alexander Ashford remained strangely still. Though couples glided across the polished floor in measured circles, many of them cast lingering glances toward the quiet pair near the center of the room. Curiosity clung to the atmosphere like perfume, thick and impossible to ignore. Alexander rested his hands lightly upon the polished wheels of his chair, his gaze steady upon Eleanor. The candlelight softened the sharp lines of his face, but there was nothing uncertain in his expression now. Whatever he intended to say had clearly been forming in his thoughts long before he entered the ballroom. "You deserve to know something before the evening ends," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone despite the crowd only steps away. Eleanor felt a ripple of nervous anticipation stir within her. "You speak as though the night has not already surprised us enough." A faint smile touched his lips. Society is rarely satisfied with one surprise. He glanced briefly across the ballroom, where guests still whispered behind fans and gloved hands. "For years I avoided rooms such as this," he continued. "Not because I feared their cruelty, but because I had grown tired of performing dignity for those who offered none in return." Eleanor listened closely, sensing that every word carried a deeper meaning than simple reflection. "But yesterday," he added, "you entered my quiet exile with an invitation so unguarded that it unsettled me entirely." She lowered her gaze slightly. "It was only an invitation." "No," he said softly. "It was a challenge." Eleanor looked back at him in surprise. "You asked me to return to the world that abandoned me," Alexander continued, "and you did so without expectation of reward. That is a rare kind of courage." The orchestra shifted into a slower melody, the notes stretching gently through the hall like a held breath. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, uncertain where the conversation was leading. "If courage was involved, it belonged equally to you. You chose to come tonight." "Yes," he replied calmly. "And now I must decide whether to leave this room as the man society remembers, or as the man I might yet become." His words carried a quiet gravity that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. Before she could answer, a figure approached from the edge of the dance floor. Lady Margaret's jeweled gown shimmered as she stepped closer, her expression bright with forced politeness. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a graceful curtsy. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you among us again." Alexander inclined his head courteously, though his eyes held little warmth. "The pleasure of the evening belongs to Miss Whitmore," he replied. "Without her kindness, I suspect I would still be reading quietly beside my window." Margaret's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. Eleanor has always possessed a talent for unusual decisions." Eleanor felt the familiar sting hidden beneath the compliment, but Alexander answered before she could respond. "Unusual decisions," he said thoughtfully, "are often the beginning of remarkable stories." Margaret glanced between them with visible skepticism. "One hopes such stories end well." "That depends entirely upon the courage of those involved," Alexander replied. The conversation had drawn the attention of several nearby guests, their quiet interest forming an invisible circle around the trio. Margaret seemed to realize she had wandered into deeper waters than intended. "Well," she said briskly, "the evening is young. I am certain the ballroom holds many delightful surprises." With that she offered another curtsy and retreated into the crowd. Alexander watched her go before turning back to Eleanor. "You see," he said gently, "even the smallest gesture unsettles the delicate order of this room." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Perhaps society is more fragile than it pretends." The Duke's expression softened at her remark. "Yes," he said quietly, "and perhaps that fragility is exactly why I must say what I intend tonight." Eleanor felt her breath catch. He turned his wheelchair slightly so that he faced the center of the ballroom once more. The orchestra had begun another lively waltz, and couples spun gracefully beneath the chandeliers. Yet Alexander's calm voice rose above the music with effortless clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. The sudden address rippled through the crowd. Conversations faltered, dancers slowed, and curious faces turned toward the Duke. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as the entire room gradually fell silent. Alexander's gaze swept calmly across the gathered nobles. "I believe I owe this assembly a small confession," he continued. "Many of you remember me as the young duke who attended every ball in London, who rode faster than wisdom advised and spoke more boldly than courtesy allowed." A few uneasy chuckles echoed through the room. "But the accident that confined me to this chair revealed something far more instructive than my own limitations," he said. "It revealed the remarkable speed with which admiration transforms into absence." The ballroom grew quieter still. "For 3 years I allowed that absence to define me," he went on. "Until yesterday, when a young woman walked into my room carrying nothing more dangerous than an invitation." He turned toward Eleanor, his eyes steady and unmistakably warm. She did not see a broken man. She saw a companion. A murmur passed through the crowd. "And tonight," Alexander said, "I find myself unwilling to return to the shadows I once accepted so easily." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "Miss Whitmore," he continued, extending his hand toward her, "your kindness restored something I believed lost." Eleanor's heart pounded as she placed her hand gently in his. Alexander's voice softened, though it carried clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "You reminded me that dignity does not depend upon society's approval. It depends upon the courage to live honestly." He drew a slow breath. "And therefore I must ask you something equally honest." The guests leaned forward with collective anticipation. "Would you allow me," he said, his gaze unwavering, "the privilege of courting you?" A wave of astonished whispers swept through the room. No one had expected such a declaration. A duke proposing affection toward a woman of modest fortune defied every quiet rule governing the evening's delicate hierarchy. Eleanor felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, yet Alexander's steady gaze held her attention completely. "You understand what you are asking," she said softly. "I do," he replied. "Society will speak endlessly about it. Society already does. You may lose their favor." Alexander's expression brightened with a hint of quiet amusement. "My reputation, Miss Whitmore, vanished the moment I disappeared from their ballrooms. What remains is my freedom to choose what matters." Eleanor searched his face, finding only sincerity there. "And what matters?" she asked gently. His answer came without hesitation. "You." The simplicity of the word sent a warmth through her chest that no whispering crowd could diminish. For a moment she allowed the silence to stretch, savoring the strange, beautiful improbability of the moment. Then Eleanor Whitmore smiled. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I believe I would like that very much." The ballroom seemed to exhale all at once. The orchestra, uncertain but eager to restore the evening's rhythm, struck up a triumphant waltz. Couples resumed dancing, though many still watched the pair at the center of the room with expressions ranging from astonishment to reluctant admiration. Alexander released a quiet breath, relief and joy mingling in his eyes. "I cannot promise grand adventures upon the dance floor," he said lightly. Eleanor laughed softly. "You have already given me the most memorable evening of my life." As the music swelled around them, the Duke guided his wheelchair slightly closer to her side. The murmurs of society gradually softened into the background hum of celebration, but something deeper had shifted within the room. The forgotten Duke had returned. And beside him stood the woman who had dared to invite him back into the world. Outside the tall windows of Hawthorne Vale, the night sky stretched clear and endless above the gardens, as though the future itself had quietly opened before them.